Right now, thousands of highly paid people in Ontario's auto industry are preparing to hear the worst possible news. Sources inside government tell CBC News the General Motors plant in Oshawa is set to shut down.
We've got breaking news to bring you this hour concerning Canada's auto sector. General Motors is dropping electric van production at its plants near London, Ontario.
Well, on to General Motors now as the company is pushing Unifor to pull its Super Bowl ad.
Economic crises don't always show up the way we expect them to. They don't always arrive with shouting in the streets, breaking news alerts, or politicians scrambling for microphones. Sometimes they start with something so small, so routine, that almost nobody notices. A bland press release, a carefully worded announcement, a sentence that seems too boring to matter, until the consequences hit like a freight train. That's exactly how it unfolded in Canada. General Motors put out a short statement, the kind of corporate update most people scroll past without thinking. It sounded normal, almost harmless. But buried inside that calm, PR-polished language was the spark that set off a shockwave across an entire region. A factory once praised as one of the pillars of Canada's electric future simply went silent. Overnight, no gradual phase-out, no backup plan, no transition for the workers whose lives were built around it. Just a cold, heavy thud of a gate locking shut, and a corporate explanation that felt more like a smokescreen than the truth. For years, people in the community believed this plant would anchor the next generation of manufacturing. Governments poured billions into it. Families planned their futures around it. Politicians cut ribbons there and called it a model for the country's electric transition. And GM repeated the same message every chance it got. Canada's workforce was essential to its EV strategy. And then, as if someone flipped a switch, that message was gone. The reaction wasn't explosive outrage or chaotic protests. It was something heavier, something that sinks into a community slowly, confusion, shock, and then a deep, unsettling realization that this wasn't just a factory shutting down. It was the collapse of everything people had been promised. More than 1,200 families weren't just losing paychecks. They were watching their plans, their security, their sense of stability dissolve in front of them. Rumors started spreading quietly at first, that the temporary pause wasn't temporary, that GM's leadership had gone silent, that communication from Detroit had dried up. Workers noticed the signs immediately. They'd seen this pattern before. Soft excuses, shifting explanations, answers that contradicted each other. First, GM said demand had dipped. Then it was supply chain rebalancing. Then it was a short suspension. Then a strategic adjustment. Every update sounded like it was trying to explain away the last one. It became obvious that GM wasn't pausing anything. It was inching out the door while hoping no one would make a scene. By early 2025, the truth was undeniable. GM wasn't coming back. Not next quarter, not next year, not ever. In the past, that might have led to the same old script. Ottawa scrambling to offer subsidies, mayors begging to keep jobs local, provinces stepping in with incentives to soften the blow. That was the Canada the auto industry was used to. The consistent, polite partner who bent to keep factories alive. But this time was different. Canada had been preparing for a moment exactly like this. Quietly, deliberately, and GM walked right into it. 3 days after GM's announcement, the federal government issued a response so simple, most people didn't realize its weight. No fiery comments, no threats. Just a calm statement from Mélanie Joly and François-Philippe Champagne, and the activation of something almost nobody outside policy circles had heard of, the auto remission framework. Months earlier, when it was introduced, most analysts overlooked it. It sounded too technical, too bureaucratic to matter. But it had a razor-sharp purpose, to ensure corporations kept their promises, or face serious consequences. It was simple, brutal, and airtight. If a company maintained production commitments in Canada, it enjoyed tariff-free access. If it broke those commitments, the tariffs kicked in automatically. No negotiations, no loopholes, no political bargaining. GM broke its commitments, and Canada pulled the trigger. Within hours, GM lost a quarter of its tariff-free import quota. Suddenly, every GM vehicle shipped from the US into Canada got slapped with a 25% tariff. A $45,000 SUV now cost more than $56,000. Dealers couldn't absorb it, customers wouldn't pay it. For the first time in decades, Canada wasn't pleading for a corporation to stay. It was punishing a corporation for walking away. Detroit woke up to the news in disbelief. There was no chance to lobby, no chance to prepare, no time to spin the narrative. The financial blow landed instantly, but the psychological hit was even bigger. The message was unmistakable. Canada wasn't playing the old game anymore, and GM wasn't the only one who felt it. Stellantis, another automotive giant with its own shaky commitments, got hit even harder. Ottawa slashed half of its tariff-free access. It was the most aggressive enforcement action Canada had taken in years, and it wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. Suddenly, automakers across North America were scrambling. Ford froze its long-term plans. Dealers started recalculating inventory costs. Executives called emergency calls. Shareholders demanded explanations. For the first time, U.S. automakers were forced to consider something they'd never imagined. Canada wasn't the easy partner anymore. It was the enforcer. And the moment that made GM truly panic hadn't even happened yet. GM reached out to Ottawa expecting the usual negotiation. A meeting, a discussion, maybe a compromise. Instead, they were handed a deadline. 15 days, no extensions, no wiggle room, no corporate storytelling. In 15 days, GM had to produce a complete written plan for the Ingersoll plant. Not vague ideas, a fully mapped production strategy. What models they would build, how many units, what investments would be made, how the plant fit into GM's long-term EV roadmap, and proof, real proof, that GM still intended to operate that facility as part of its future. If they delivered, Canada would consider revisiting the tariffs. If they didn't, the tariffs would become permanent on every GM vehicle entering the country. Permanent tariffs would destroy GM's market position in Canada. Dealerships would fold, competitors would race in, and GM's fragile EV strategy, already under pressure, would take a hit it might never recover from. And GM had no legal way out of it. Canada's framework was ironclad. While GM scrambled to craft a plan, another storm gathered in the background, one with geopolitical consequences. Trade talks between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney finally seemed to be stabilizing. But one Ontario-funded ad criticizing U.S. tariffs infuriated Trump enough to walk away from the negotiations completely. The fragile relationship collapsed overnight. And that vacuum opened a door, one China stepped through immediately. For the first time in years, China held direct, high-level discussions with Canada. Beijing hinted it could lift agricultural restrictions, including the damaging canola ban, if Canada reconsidered its tax on Chinese EVs. This wasn't random, it was strategic. China sensed an opportunity. Inside Canada, the ground shifted even further. Public opinion began turning. Polls showed Canadians were becoming more skeptical of U.S. policies than Chinese ones, a perspective unimaginable just a decade earlier. People weren't suddenly pro-China. They were tired of volatility from Washington. For Canada, this wasn't ideology, it was survival. A country can't rely on a partner whose policies swing dramatically overnight. So Canada began exploring new paths, carefully, cautiously, but unmistakably. What started as one factory closure had turned into something far bigger, a reshaping of North America's power dynamics. GM thought it was making a business call. Instead, it triggered one of the biggest economic wake-up calls in modern Canadian history. A middle power nation had stood its ground, used the laws it built, and forced multinational giants to confront a reality they didn't expect. Canada had leverage, real leverage, and it wasn't afraid to use it. North America felt the shift immediately, and once a country discovers its own leverage, it never goes back to staying quiet.